that. We are going to have several speakers today to talk with us about work that they are doing on the Truth Project and some of the experiences that they have. We're going to take just a second to make sure that the group is ready. I note that most of our speakers are here. We're going to give Ben just another moment to join us so that he doesn't feel out of the loop. But if there are things that you want to give voice to, as we get started, this is the final day of this week's activities. It's been a long week, a productive week, a heavy week in many ways. And so if anyone would like to give voice to what they're experiencing this morning, what they're experiencing throughout the week, what they hope to experience in the coming weeks, months, years of this project and its implementation, we'll just make space for a moment. I don't want this to be awkward, and I don't insist that anybody bail me out by talking while we wait for Ben, but if that's a use that we can make of this time, let's do it. So if you have any thoughts, anecdotes, witticisms to share, please do. So again, welcome. Good morning and greetings. My name is Joseph Bauer-Kemper. It's my honor to serve as moderator. So just to give an introduction and make sure nothing gets lost in the chat, I suppose, during the session. I am a settler citizen or denizen, I suppose, of the 1854 Treaty Territory, where I serve on the faculty in the Department of American Indian Studies at the Duluth campus of the University of Minnesota. I'm a graduate of the American Studies program in the Twin Cities. I also serve as an affiliate faculty member for the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. The session we have for you this morning, which is our fifth and final day of the series that we've put together, not we, I really haven't played a significant role in that, but Tad and his team, Anne, Sophie, Misty, Ben, Adriana, have worked really hard to coordinate these sessions. And here we are on the fifth day of quite a bit. And we're going to begin today with a session that features Anne Garagiola, Ben Yawakie, and Dr. Sophie Hunt. Anne is a candidate for the Master of Public Policy degree at the Humphrey School, and Ben is pursuing both the Master of Public Health and the Master of Public Policy, all at the University of Minnesota. Both Anne and Ben currently serve as graduate assistants working on the Truth Project under Tad Johnson. And Dr. Sophie Hunt is a graduate of the History doctoral program at the University of Michigan. And Sophie currently serves as internship coordinator for Minnesota Transform and has extensive experience in archival research and public history projects. So this session you can see on your screen there inside the Heart of the Beast is working, as that title suggests, to think about and to discuss how the Truth Core team members that are presenting for us have already been engaging in research in the Minnesota Historical Society archives and in university archives. They're going to provide tips for how to access and search materials there, and they're going to talk about some of the topics that they've identified and already pursued, including the university's early boards of regents, the university's deep involvement in land dispossession and profiteering, and industrial interests that the university has promoted and has itself and continues to profit from. They're going to share some of the initial insights into these topics and reflect on their experiences thus far doing this sort of research work. And they're also going to discuss, perhaps most immediately and practically, how tribal research fellows can collaborate with them as a support structure, as a partnership team, and use this team as a resource to support you, the tribal research fellows, as you develop your work plans and as you potentially dig in to archival research of your own, if that proves to be a relevant method for what you're going for. So we'll first hear from our featured presenters, and then we'll have Q&A and discussion. As always, feel free to interject with thoughts, questions, comments that you have, whether by unmuting and saying hello or over in the chat, however and whenever you feel that it is best. So thanks a ton for being here, and I'll happily hand it over to the team.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you all for being here on this last day of our 5-day training. And just acknowledging, as Joseph said, that it's been a long and a heavy week. And so I know that we're all coming with a lot on our hearts and minds as we move from the week of training into months of working together. And that's really, listening to that abstract, we promised a lot. We're going to do some of what we promised, but talking to Anne and Ben yesterday, as we were sort of putting some final touches on our presentation, I think what was most important to us this morning was to give us a chance to fill you in on everything we've been researching and thinking about so far, especially that Anne and Ben, as graduate students here at U of M, have been researching and thinking about. They've been working on this project for 1.5 years now and have done extensive research. And most of this presentation is going to be them sharing everything that they have learned, both in terms of the history of the university's relationship with tribal nations, but also what it's like to be in the archive as Native students and as people relatively new to archival research. And then the second goal is to start moving forward together. We've had a lot of conversations over the last months about what it will look like for us to collaborate with tribal research fellows, for us to support tribal research fellows. And we have ideas, but we don't really know for sure what that's going to look like, because a lot of that depends on what you need. And so after Anne and Ben present on their work, I'm going to suggest some things that we've talked about and really want to hear from you about what you'd like the relationship with the core research team to look like moving forward. So outline, we're going to start by having, it was going to be Ben and Anne, but it may just be Anne at this point, talking about the memo from MIAC to the university that was written in 2020, that they did a lot of historical research in collaboration with others to write. Then each of them will share some insights from their time in the archive. And then at the end, as I said, I will talk about some potential ways to connect with our team, which also includes Adriana Goodwin, who is wearing many hats this semester moving forward. So with that, I'll introduce myself a little more extensively later, but I'm actually just going to jump right into Anne talking about the memo.
Yeah, hi, and apologies in advance. We're in a pretty rural area and the snow is messing with our internet, so I'm going to leave my video off. I'm just going to introduce myself here. Bujuan Dinaway Maganadug and Indigenous Asabakoni Zagagan in Dunjaba, Imanishka in Dunjaba, Withrow in Da. Hello, my relatives. My name is Anne. I come from the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa at Nett Lake, where my mom is an enrolled member. I was born and raised in St. Paul, and I currently live in Withrow, Minnesota, with my sons Jacopo and Atreyu. I'm honored to share this space with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my time in the archives and share some of my research with you, which focuses on the role the Regents played in the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples on this land. All of the information that I present will be available in your shared drive and Canvas page, and I'm happy to talk more with folks who are interested in the land grab aspect of this project. So Jeannie had asked us to talk a little bit about the origins of the memo. So we began interning with TAD like literally right before everything went on lockdown. So most of our internship has been online. But back in March of 2020, TAD was working in his capacity as Director of Tribal Nations Relations, and in coordination with Jamie Edwards, who was the Director of the Government Affairs Office, asked TAD to, if we could help write these resolutions, calling on the university to become better relative to the 11 recognized tribal nations of Minnesota, as well as all Indigenous people. So there's a lot in the memo. It's much longer than your typical policy memo. I believe it's 17 pages total. But as we were going through and writing, it became really apparent to us quickly that we couldn't include all of these things, right? And there's so much more that could have been included, but we had about 5 days to do all of this research, write the memo and the accompanying resolution. So I'm glad to answer any questions that you all may have about that, how that came about, or what is in it. But that's just a little bit about how this project started. So once that memo was sent over to MIAC, then they issued their resolutions calling on the university to do multiple things, including rematriating the members collection and ancestors, establishing American Indian advisory boards on all campuses, which has been done at this point, as well as working to strengthen relationships that really haven't existed between the tribes and the university ever. And I'll talk more maybe throughout my presentation that will become clear as to why. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to open with this quote from Audra Simpson, who is a Mohawk scholar of anthropology. And I come to her work because she offers a critique of what she refers to as liberal political performances of reconciliation and recognition in so-called Canada, which I've been researching as part of my master's thesis. And she discusses history as a past that does not form a departure for Indigenous people in the same way it does for settlers, because our present collapses their past. It calls up the past as we contort still to make way for everyone else's present and future. So I think about that quote a lot when I'm in the archives, because there it's more apparent than anywhere else, reading in the region's own handwriting, the will to what they refer to on multiple occasions as quote unquote dealing with the Indian problem. As Simpson goes on to discuss her lecture on the folly of reconciliation in so-called Canada, she discusses how we were not meant to still be here, fighting the very institutions that they built not only to keep us out, but in an attempt to wipe us out. So to me, this quote is a reminder of their failure and the power that we hold by being in these spaces, by refusing to contort or make ourselves smaller to make way for their perception of what history should be. Next slide, please. All right, so this is an image of a preemption claim that was filed with the General Land Office in the 1860s. Sophie and I began researching at MNHS because I wanted to find the receipt for the first parcel of land the university sold to fund their creation, and that would be the 1851 land grab. I don't know why I haven't figured out a way to explain it yet, but I feel it's really important to honor that location. And as we were going through these boxes and boxes of land claim disputes, it led to questions about the names on the papers, which led to me questioning who were the first Board of Regents and what role did they play in land acquisition. So this really speaks to, I think, what the archivists, both at MNHS and UMN, were discussing earlier in the week about following links between the collections, and that it's really dependent on luck, or what they called serendipity. And I also just want to bring attention to what they said about paying attention to other perspectives, language of the times, because this content is difficult. Next slide, please. All right, so this image is of the act providing for the government and regulation of the University of Minnesota. The university enjoys constitutional autonomy, and that law was created by the men who would go on to be named the founding Board of Regents. That list is on the left of the slide. And this is the same men who were sitting in seats of power in the territorial government. So constitutional autonomy has 4 main points. What this means primarily is that the Board of Regents alone are empowered to manage the university. that judicial relief or the ability to sue is available if the regents abuse the management powers that they've been granted by the state constitution, that the legislature may place conditions on the appropriations the university gets, as long as those conditions do not violate the university's autonomy, and also that the university is subject to general lawmaking power so far as it does not impede the regent's ability to manage the university. Next slide, please. Lori asked me to share an image of the timeline I'm creating on my wall. So that's what this is. And it really talks about the early regents' connections to treaties, anti-Native legislation, Dakota genocide and exile, Dakota and Anishinaabe land dispossession, and the exile of Ho-Chunk and Cheyenne people. So for too long, the university has been able to, by virtue of it being one of the world's preeminent R1 research institutions, they've been able to propagate the notion that it was a benevolent benefactor of tragedy, or that it simply inherited its land from the federal government through political acts that were separate and distinct from the university. However, from the records found in the archives, we know this to be untrue. And I believe it's time to reclaim that narrative of how the university truly came into existence, that it was methodically planned and executed by the very founders of the institution. So finding the names on the in the MNHS archives was a pretty big breakthrough, and that sent us back to the University of Minnesota archives. And with the help of Ellen Holt-Worrell, who presented the other day, I was able to access the Daniel Sprague papers. And Mr. Sprague was an accountant and recorder of the experimental station from 1887 to 1890. And Ellen had flaked his papers because it contained a report that he had written titled A History of the University Land Grants. The report by Mr. Sprague was most insightful into the minds of the first Board of Regents, and really showed an intent by these men to commit genocide to steal land. And the receipts show coordination between members of the board, state and federal governments, and industry officials, including those from the timber and mining industry, to lie, cheat, displace, murder, and steal Native lands. This also illuminates how the formation of the quasi-governmental body, that is the university, came about. The Board of Regents was the government was the board, and they made sure through the charter to that when Minnesota became a state in 1858, that the university was granted that constitutional autonomy that I just discussed, allowing for self-governance from the state. So there was 12 original members of the Board of Regents, and I have started timelines on 3 of them so far. And so I'll just quickly go through one. There's a lot of information, and so we've heard a lot. If anybody wants to ask questions or stop me midway, go ahead. I'm all about dialogue instead of just lecturing to you all. So I'm going to discuss Henry Sibley, who was a fur trader and who became the first congressional delegate for the territory of Minnesota. In this capacity, he introduced a bill that would become the first land grant in Minnesota, giving the territory 2 townships for university purposes. On February 13th, 1851, just 3 days after Congress passed the land grant memorial, the state legislature, or the territorial legislature, passed the university's first charter, stating that the institution was to be located at or near the Falls of St. Anthony. Given Sibley's connection to Dakota communities and knowledge of the importance of this place to Dakota people, makes this act more insidious. I'm going to go back in Sibley's history a little bit because I think that it shows, it really lays the ground for intent and shows that this is not any new behavior on his part. So in 1834, Sibley was appointed the regional manager of the American Fur Company's Sioux outfit. and he stationed himself at Mendota. He was at the age of 23. The AFC departments were soon sold to partners who included Sibley, and the business strategy of the company changed from fur trading to treaty making. In 1837, the Dakota and Pine Treaties coincided with the collapse of the fur trade, and Sibley and other new owners of AFC used their political connections to ensure that treaty monies would first go to fur traders to pay off the debts incurred, because AFC had created a debt cycle by increasing prices on goods by as much as 300% when folks came back with furs to trade. In 1838, he was appointed the first justice of the peace west of the Mississippi. And in 1839, he married a Dakota woman by the name of Tashina Ohindaway. In English, that's Red Blanket Woman, from what I can gather from the records. And they had one daughter. Her English name was Helen Hastings. She would be sent to live with missionaries by her father after her mother died when she was just 1 year old. Sibley also took part in passing the Preemption Act, which permitted squatters who were living on quote unquote federal government land to purchase up to 160 acres. 1 year later, AFC went bankrupt, and Sibley leaves Tashina Ohindaway and marries a sister of a friend of his, Franklin Steele, who also would go on to become one of the first members of the Board of Regents. In 1848, Sibley was elected the first delegate to U.S. Congress from the Wisconsin Territory, which included much of present-day Minnesota, east of the Mississippi River. And there he advocated for the creation of Minnesota Territory from a portion of Wisconsin and an additional tract of land west of the Mississippi. So in 1849, Minnesota becomes a territory. And he was selected at that time to represent those to represent mixed blood people during treaty negotiations because of his connections with the Dakota community and because he had a mixed race daughter. In 1849, he served as the territorial delegate to Congress. And in 1851, he represented not only mixed blood interests, but also fur traders' interest in the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, which resulted in 24 million acres of land being open to European settlers. And this was the same year then, shortly after, that the statute was written that the University of Minnesota be established at or near the Falls of St. Anthony. And he would go on at that point to be elected to the Board of Regents and thus retire from the fur trade. He liquidated all of his holdings and began investing in the very land he had just negotiated in treaties at Traverse des Sioux, Mendota, Hastings, and St. Anthony Falls. In 1857, he helped to pass the Enabling Act, which allowed settlers to vote for Minnesota to become a state, which happened in 1858. And he was then elected as governor of Minnesota. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the university regents were long making plans that the university would be built on Dakota lands and making moves towards this end through influence over state and federal policies. So on the Enabling Act that I just mentioned that Sibley helped to pass, it discusses that there should be 72 sections of land set apart and reserved for the use and support of a state university. Because at the time that was set aside for a territorial university, when Minnesota gained statehood, the regents thought that this left enough question to say that Minnesota was promised twice acreage, one for territorial university purposes and the second for state university purposes. So these images that are on this slide show communications between the regents and Henry Rice, who was a senator at the time, was asked to assert influence to gain another tract of land to fund what they were calling a state university. And they fought for this for about a decade. Next slide, please. So in 1860, the university closed. By this time, just 2 years before the US-Dakota War, the university was in extreme debt due to financial mismanagement. The total debts owed by the institution were $120,000. That's equivalent in purchasing power in today's money to about 4 million, and they had no funds or income to pay off that debt. So we learned from the Sprague papers that the regents agitated the matter of a new land grant, as it seemed inevitable that their entire previous land grant would be sacrificed, as they said, to pay off their indebtedness. The governor at the time, Alexander Ramsey, who was also a member of the founding board, recommended that the first land grant be turned over to the university's creditors, many of whom included members of the first board of regents. And finally, in 1864, through the influence of John Pillsbury, the legislature appointed 3 new board of regents. And this was a special act. And these 3 men, Pillsbury, Merriam, and Nichols, were appointed to basically bail the university out of their financial mess. And they did so by 1867, when the university opened back up. So by this time, the regents had learned that they could hoard vast wealth through land dispossession. And if we recall from the High Country News article that kind of started all of this look into land grant universities, Lee and Atone write that if we consider the wider significance of the session of 1851 and its grim aftermath to the National Land Grant University system, no other Indigenous session provided more land to universities. Nearly 830,000 acres from this treaty, an area almost 3 times the size of Los Angeles, would help fund the endowment of 35 land grant universities. Minnesota Makoche furnished 1 out of every 13 acres redistributed under the subsequent act, Morrill Act of 1862. Ramsey claimed that Minnesota's windfall, as they call it, happened just 5 weeks after he ordered the largest mass execution in US history, with the hanging of 38 Dakota men in Mankato on December 26, 1862. And according to the CURA analysis, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, who analyzed that data, as we heard from them on Wednesday, they got a return on investment on this land of 25,000%. And that was more than any other land grant institution had. And so from this point, I started reading more into the Regents' minutes, and I'm at about 1860 right now. And this year is really illuminating as to how the Board of Regents chose the lands that they stole. And in fact, their meeting notes from August 28th, 1860 discuss the choosing of the remaining lands. They had about 4,000 acres of land that they hadn't sold yet from the first 1851 land grab. And they write about how they are seeking specifically 3,000 or 4,000 acres of pine lands, well timbered and convenient to floating streams to be selected. So to me, this says that their choice of lands helped them profit even further because of their connections to timber and mining industries. Next slide, please. All right, so the university has long claimed to be a benevolent benefactor of the violence, genocide, and land dispossession enacted by agents of colonialism through state and federal policies. As the region's preeminent institution of higher education, that narrative has been accepted by the public at large. This research shows that the University of Minnesota was established as a type of shell corporation. It no longer is, obviously, it owns vast wealth, but this was one method among many used by these politicians to funnel and launder monies made from the dispossession and genocide of Minnesota Makoche's indigenous people to that perpetual transfer of wealth to white settlers that Jeannie talked about during her presentation. So I just want to close by saying, I know that this is emotionally challenging. We've all experienced that this week. It's important to take care of ourselves, as Shannon mentioned earlier. And we've worked hard to offer support services that we'll talk more about later. But for now, I'll hand things over to Ben.
Jan. And I apologize for joining a little late. I don't know if I realize the MIAC memo history wasn't in here. Is that something that we wanted to talk about, or should I just dive into my personal experience?
We talked a little bit about it before you signed on. And so if there's more that you want to add, I think that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize once again for entering late. And since I don't necessarily know all that was covered, I guess I'll just give my introduction to myself and then continue on with my personal experiences. So my name is Ben Yawakie, and I'm a citizen of the Pueblo of Zuni and a descendant of Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, North Dakota, Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux in Montana, and White Bear First Nations in Saskatchewan. I'm a graduate student working on completing my Master's of Public Policy and Master's of Public Health this spring semester. And I'm also a core member, or a member of the core university team, and that's made up of Tad, Misty, and Adrian and Sophie. And so, as you can see from this, or can you switch to the next slide, please? Yeah, so as you can see from the title of this page, I wanted to start off my presentation just by talking about some of the personal experiences that I had before I came into the archives, and how that kind of has influenced the point of, or the area of the research that I've done and where I've gone since the creation of that MIAC memo about 2 years ago. And so when I first started this research on the MIAC memo, I actually came across this journal article that's, as you can see, is titled "First Our Land, Now Our Health." And this was actually in a journal that was published by an organization called Science for the People. And that's like kind of a citizen activist organization. And they had actually done this article over 10 years ago. And so this was the first piece of information that I had received that was outside of the University of Minnesota resources. That really allowed me to get an understanding of Red Lake outside of some of the experience that Tad had with reaching out, or being reached out to by Sam Strong, and starting to hear some of those personal stories coming from the tribe. And so I just want to talk about some of the experiences that I had diving in from there, and then how that kind of helped some of my ability to go into the University of Minnesota library archives. And just kind of how that experience about, you find one thing, and then as Tad's talked about with some of the issue spotting, or being able to identify different names like the librarians have mentioned, how that kind of opens up a treasure trove of additional materials. And so it was through that first article that I was able to find out about Louis Wanamaker, who was the doctor and a medical researcher that's part of the university team that had conducted a majority of the research around glomerulonephritis. And it was also through finding out more about these articles that were published by Wanamaker that we were able to find out that there was the U.S. Army connection with respect to grants and contracts that were paid out by the U.S. military to fund these projects. And then I also just wanted to highlight how, based on the conversations that we have had with the librarians, particularly yesterday with Eric Moore, and how he had mentioned additional doctor's name had came up. And he had mentioned the doctor's name was Alfred Michael. And that was a name that I hadn't come across. So through conversations that I had with Eric yesterday, I was able to share, like on this bottom right, there's a gentleman named Dr. Burton Dudding. And so I was able to share that name with Eric, and Eric was able to share this name with me. And those are additional names that I just wanted to share the experience of, being able to utilize those librarians as resources to continue the research that we'll be doing is, what I've come to find through doing this archival research is we'll be finding information like this, but then we'll be finding, specific names or like keywords that will then be sending back to the librarians to engage in further research. And so that was an example that I wanted to cover with respect to Red Lake, and how you'll be finding, or you'll be able to use additional resources outside of what's available through the university that also may facilitate with some of the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. And then this was another example of some of the research we had done with the MIAC memo that I wanted to cover about my personal experience before I went into the archives. And so with respect to this project, this was something that I hadn't known about. And I thought that was particularly interesting just due to the fact that back in like the 90s, my parents had been members of the American Indian Advisory Council or Committee for the Twin Cities. And these weren't this topic wasn't something that was brought up back then, and it wasn't something that was on their radar. And so, for me, having been involved with the university since I was in middle school, so about like 20 years now, is it had a special significance due to the fact that I'm a citizen of the Pueblo of Zuni. And the reason that I bring that up is because I know we've touched on a lot of heavy topics. And this was something that kind of caught me by surprise. As I mentioned, I hadn't known about this. And so I think it's just mindful, with some of the topics of interest that some of the other interns have or research fellows have around, like birch bark scrolls, continuing doing research on understanding the Red Lake medicinal research that was done, even, the land grant institution and land grab situation, as well as, learning more about like Nelson Act and Cloquet Forestry Center, is that there's gonna be a lot of times that this trauma is reactivated, and that we go through it. And so I think, being mindful of that is something that I think, we've been learning as we've been going. And, I think back to like when we had our tribal research fellow meeting, and, ensuring that we do like a convocation, doing prayers and smudging and taking care of ourselves and self-care. And so I just wanted to bring that up as a point to remind everyone while they're doing this, or as they're starting to do this research, because, what I found out from doing some of this background research about Albert Jenks was he was the quote unquote father of the anthropology department. And through the course of creating this department, he had a lot of research that was geared towards utilizing archaeology, anthropology to legitimize racial hierarchies of like social constructs. And so, and then tying that into an understanding that he was also chosen by members of state, federal governments to be a point person for Indian policy. And so it starts to tell us a larger story than I thought was possible, than the large story of having taken ancestral remains and funerary objects. And so I just wanted to talk about that, about my personal experience, and just being mindful of that as we start this research. Can you move to the next slide, please? All right, and so now that I've shared some of the overview of some of the research that I did before going in the archives, I wanted to share my experience about being able to go into the basement of this picture right here. Is just like the outside of, there's a reading room in the Twin Cities. I don't know if anyone's going to have the opportunity to physically go into this space, but I just wanted to now talk about what the experience was like going into the basement, which is where the archives exist. It's extremely massive. I don't remember the exact square footage, but I also just wanted to take this time to mention that, while we go into this physical space, this is where we've been doing a lot of the, or not a lot, this is where we have been doing the digitization efforts. Personally, while we're waiting to send in the request to the librarian services. And so I know Sophie will go into, the Google Drive and being able to navigate, those photos and what we've been able to catalog. But I just wanted to take this time to say that, while we're waiting for that digitization request process to happen, is that, there's plenty of us in the Twin Cities that'll be able to be available to get a jump start on those digitization requests, especially since the research is starting, and you'll need that access. And then I also wanted to just highlight, because I think it was mentioned yesterday, or it was mentioned, I think with like the librarian services, was there was a conversation around like doing work for the librarians. And I wanted to just make a comment about that for the Tribal Research Fellows, is we're creating our own separate archive of all the documents that we're digitizing. And once we're completed with this project, or processing the requests that you have for information, is that this Google Drive, all these documents will be wholly owned by the Tribal Research Fellows, MIAC, and not the university. And so I just wanted to just say that, because I didn't get a chance to say that yesterday. And then also, as a highlight for the archives, I just wanted to highlight for anyone from northern Minnesota that the University of Minnesota Duluth librarians and archivists had mentioned that they would like, if you were going to be going into their archives, that they wanted as much of a heads up as possible, just due to the fact that they have a 2-person team, and they said that they have like backlog. And so those are some of the experiences that they had. So hey there, Mike, I see that. And I guess I'll just say this too, Mike, I did want to reach out about some of the interests that you have around the mounds, because I know with like when I was going to Augsburg University or Augsburg College, and I went through their libraries, as I found a bunch of old Minnesota Historical Society bound books that they had in their collection. And through those geological surveys that they did at the beginning of the incorporation of the state of Minnesota, is they went through and they documented and cataloged all the mounds in the state. And that was something that I found in those MNHS books, was maps of locations throughout the state of where mounds exist. And that was something that I hadn't known and I hadn't really seen anyone talk about. But anyways, so I will now go into some of my experiences going into the archives. So if you could switch to the next slide, please. And so what this slide shows is like just one image of a specific aisle on the many aisles that we had the ability to see in the basement where the archives exist. And I brought this up because this is an extension of some of the Alfred Jenks research that I had done before we had gone into the archives. And I included this because I wanted to touch on what Anne had mentioned with respect to like the serendipitous nature, or the luck that comes with some of the research that we do, and going into the archives. Is this, like I said, this picture doesn't do justice for how expansive the archives is. And so we were all walking through and just doing our own exploration. And as you can see, there's on the right side of this picture, there's all these boxes, and just imagining boxes like just covering all those aisles is I was just like glancing around, seeing what was available. And I actually started looking. There was like little tiny pieces of paper that were attached to these boxes that showed specifically what was in these boxes. And the first box that I tried to take a look at had Jenks research and Alfred B. Jenkins that were listed on the side. And so I pulled the box, and within that box, I was able to find the original memorandum of agreement between the then Minneapolis Fine Arts, Society of Fine Arts, which became or is now the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and the University of Minnesota. And I just bring this up because that personal connection that I have. I just thought that sometimes the creator speaks to us in different ways, and for me to have come across that and to have that personal connection with me as Zuni Pueblo, I just thought that was an interesting experience, and I'm sure that might be something that other people come across. But yeah, that was just something that I wanted to mention. And can we switch to the next slide, please? And yeah, so continued on through that, and this continues on into the potential research for the future is, so with this memorandum of agreement is, there's the list of signatories who were paid for this archaeological excavation or dig. And just doing a little bit of background research on information for these individuals is, a lot of them are regents, bankers. They're tied with the flower industry. And so I didn't go into a deep dive like Ann did with the first board of regents, but it's always interesting to see who these individuals are, because as Ann said with Sibley, Rice, and Ramsey, is there's always ulterior motives that are at play that interconnect between like personal interests, state interests, and then university interests. And then something for future research that came up was the fact that not only did the university go through the process of taking these ancestral remains and funerary objects, is that while they were under the care of the Department of Anthropology at the university, is that they were made available for multiple different research studies, even up until the 2000s. And that's been some information that I found out from Kat Hayes. But through those conversations that I had with her, we also found out that there does not exist a full history of how these remains have been utilized while under the care of the university. And so that's an area that is going to be ongoing with respect to being able to try to identify what where these research experiments were conducted. And this is due to the fact that Kat had mentioned that there were no records that were kept about when people came in, utilized the remains. And the case in point with that was, it was like early on after the collection had been brought into the university, that there were several objects that were stolen. And so that just goes to show some of the lack of care that was taken with respect to maintaining these remains while they're in the care and the possession of the university. Next slide, please. And on this slide, I included a few pictures that show a stepwise process that we have taken for how we kind of catalog what we're finding in the archives. And so I included in this slide a picture of the box on the right. And this shows that it came from the College of Forestry. And this one was specifically flagged for us by the librarians because it contained the report on permanent university fund lands and mineral rights. And as Anne had mentioned, we were able to look through the Sprague papers that show a legal history of the University of Minnesota as a land grant institution. Now, this report shows all the financial information for the Permanent University Fund, and specifically, it shows those funds as it relates to mineral rights and timber rights. And there are several portions of this report that I thought were illuminating. And the picture on the top right is one of those that I thought was particularly interesting. And I just wanted to share what it says just because I realize it's a little faint to read. It says, the main source of revenue in the future that will be added to the Permanent University Fund will be from minerals that are produced from those lands in which the state owns the minerals, except for the royalty that will be paid for taconite. The total future yield from minerals is difficult to estimate until such time as the lands are fully explored. And we can see here that along with the illegal land dispossession and subsequent profiteering that occurred by the state of Minnesota and the University of Minnesota, that they also took along with them subsurface mineral and timber rights. These natural resources have provide an additional source of funding, particularly in density-rich areas like the Northwoods and the Mesabi Range. Next slide, please. So as an extension of what I had talked about in that past slide about taconite mining and mineral rights, I wanted to cover some of the information that we found from the university relations pieces of the archives, specifically folders that were relating to the mines experiment station and the School of Mines and Metallurgy that I found in that were found in the archives. And specifically, I was able to find two boxes that touched on taconite and iron ore research. The research that I decided to pull this information was for some of the reasons that have been raised around projects like the Polymet copper nickel mine, as well as continued mining in the Mesabi Range. Although protections like the Department of Interior moratorium on projects affecting the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness and surrounding watersheds exists, these projects continue to threaten water quality in northern Minnesota. The resolution passed by MI does in part reference acknowledging injustices which directly and indirectly benefits industry. And so I wanted to at least include documentation of this information for tribal archives. The pictures I've included are excerpts from various reports that I think are particularly insightful for the scope of mineral rights, as well as the scope of the benefit of research that the University of Minnesota conducted on behalf of extraction industry. With respect to University of Minnesota mineral right holdings, there existed 43,000 acres of state land in which the state owns the mineral rights and permanent university fund lands. With respect to the scope of research conducted by the University of Minnesota, and I quote, the potential semi-taconite and oxidized taconite reserves in the area are estimated in the billions of tons, which in terms of 50 million tons of iron pellets produced per year would mean anywhere from 100 to 1,000 years of business and prosperity. The mine's experiment station now provides the key to these ores, which because of their extent can be mined in a cheaper, non-selective open pit manner. And the recent patents obtained by Lawver at the time were also transferred to the university, and they acted as a protection for Minnesota industry. And this allowed them to continue to benefit financially and economically from the research that they conducted. And additionally, another report states the use of pellets has increased the iron reserves of North America enormously. 20 years ago, less than 85,000 tons of iron ore pellets were produced by industry. And today this exceeds 85 million, a factor of 1,000. And so I know some of the tribal fellows haven't necessarily talked about wanting to engage in some of this research around the industry, but it was something that came up through what was pulled from the archives. And I feel like, with respect to the resolution that MIAC passed and touching on industry, that it was important to highlight some of these, some of the research history that the university has been engaged with, more specifically with industry benefiting industry. But then, as we turn the page, looking at how future recommendations are laid out, is what we see as like potential future research with how the university can benefit tribes on the flip end of it. And so that concludes my portion of the presentation. Miigwech, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present, and I will now pass it on to Sophie.
Thank you, Ben. So my part of the presentation will be a little briefer, and hopefully at the end of this, we'll have time to begin a little bit of discussion about how the work that Ben and Anne have been doing intersects with the work that all of you are planning to do and how we might work together. I want to start by just introducing myself again. My professional introduction, as Joseph said, is that I work at the university as internship coordinator for the Minnesota Transform grant initiative. But I was trained as a historian. I have a PhD in history from University of Michigan, which I wrote in my bio was a land grant institution. I learned from Jeannie this week that it is not a land grant institution. Michigan State is the land grant institution there. But regardless, have considerable experience organizing historical research and doing archival research. And so when Tad discovered that there was an extra historian around, he encouraged me to join the team. My research engaged American Indian history and settler colonial histories in other parts of North America. And so I was really pleased to join this. My personal introduction is that I, like Anne, was born and raised in St. Paul. Like Joseph, I'm a non-Indigenous Minnesotan, a settler citizen here, and have been, my ancestors have been here since the 1850s, so part of the earliest settler colonial occupation here. And my dad was a first-generation college student at the U in the 70s, back when public education was affordable and you could work your way through college. So I have personal connections to this work as well. And especially as we've been digging into the first Board of Regents and the Morrill Act and all of that, I'm thinking about my family's place in that story, not as the people enacting the policies or the people funding the policies, but as the farmers that this was all for. And so I'm saying that leading into this because I think a big part of the closing of this presentation is thinking about our roles and how we'll interact with each other moving forward as university researchers and tribal research fellows, as tribal nations and university. And I think we really have questions for you as a university research team about how you'd like that collaboration to look. So anyway, I'll get into more of that later. I have 3 points that I want to move through. First, just touching again on what Ben said about digitization and data sovereignty. Then I want to show you the shared folder that we've been using to work together so far, which you have access to. And then I just want to give a high level of ways that we're thinking that we might be useful to you and able to collaborate with you. So thank you, Ben. You sort of said better anything I was planning to say here, but just kind of a recap. I think both because of issues of data sovereignty and because of all of the points that the archivists and Anne and Ben made about the serendipitous nature of research and the the need to be able to follow links among collections and among archives as someone doing archival research. We know as a core University of Minnesota team that it is essential that key collections to tribal nations and to tribal research fellows get digitized in a large and well done way. And so we are engaged in an effort to work with the university to get entire collections or boxes available to you, but it's hard to know at this point what the timeline of that's going to be. And so, as Ben mentioned, we're already taking photos of things, and those are all available to you. And in our mind, those are all yours. And we are very open to you sort of directing us in terms of what we get photos of now, which will not be the high quality resolution, full scale digitization that we hope will happen later, but hopefully it can at least help you as you get started on your research. So I'm going to show you the folder that we've been using within Google Drive to work together. And there's a shortcut to this folder within your shared Google Drive. So you'll have access to this. You actually have edit access as well. So as we're thinking about working together, this doesn't have to be a one directional thing. If you would also like to keep photos and notes here and work with us, that would be great. It's not necessary. It's sort of on the table as one option for working together. So this is how our folder looks so far. I had a dream that it would be perfectly organized for you by today, and instead it is really a work in progress. And so I'm going to show you what we have, and know that we are still adding and working on this. So one thing that this folder is a place where we are keeping all of our photos and all of our notes when we have been going to the archive, which has only been for about a month or two at this point. I think Anne has been there the most, and then Ben, and then Adriana and I have been going in a little less. So we've got a folder for Minnesota Historical Society. We have a folder for University of Minnesota. And then in there, we sort of have it organized the way that the archives themselves are organized, or at least that's the vision of how it will eventually be. So one of the archival repositories at University of Minnesota is the University Archives. We heard from those archivists earlier this week. If you go in there, then we have folders by collection. These are the collections that we've looked at so far. You've heard Anne and Ben talk about some of these, the Daniel Sprague papers, the College of Forestry collection, excuse me. The School of Agriculture collection was one of the ones that I looked at the days that I went to the archive. When you go into that collection, you'll see, I wish you could see the full title for this. School of Agriculture box 1. So I just went through one box. When I go into that box, I have a page of notes that I took as I was doing that research. And then I have photographs organized by folders. And so this is sort of my vision for how we might be working together. I wanted it to be really, really organized, both to help the core university team work together, and then also to make it as accessible as possible to you if you choose to go through our notes, so that you don't just have like a million photographs without any idea of where these photographs came from, but that you actually have some information about why we photographed those things, about what's in the photographs, that will help you decide whether they would be useful to you. So this is what I've suggested to Anne and Ben and Adriana that we do moving forward as we take notes, and I think we're planning to follow that process. Just a little bit about the School of Agriculture collection, since we hadn't talked about it yet. What I found in this box that was most interesting to me are a number of histories written about the school in the 1930s that are sort of looking back in a celebratory way about the founding of the School of Agriculture, which went hand in hand with the Morrill Act. And so as I was reading through this, what ended up becoming really striking to me was the way that people within the School of Agriculture at least wanted to say that Minnesotans had been not only benefiting from the Morrill Act, but that settlers here had played a role in the founding of the Morrill Act. And I don't actually know if that's true, but I think it's notable that they, it wasn't just sort of an accident that these land grabs happened, but that they actually celebrated them and saw them as a really good thing. And so those are sort of the notes that I took that you can read more about here. So you've got the notes. If you find something in here that seems interesting, then you can go back to the folder. I was doing this really well earlier today, and now I'm struggling to see it because of everything on Zoom and my screen. Going back to the School of Agriculture, you've got photos of anything that I took notes on. So I'm just going to go back out to the university archives so you see these other things. We've got a little bit of cleaning up to do, but Ben's pictures are just in a folder called Ben's Pictures right now, but here you can see the information about the mines and metallurgy, mines experiment station, some of those things that he was talking about earlier, as well as the photographs that he shared on his slides from when we were in the stacks of the archive, which I just have to say, as someone who's done research in a lot of archives, that was a really unique experience. And rarely do you get to walk through and just pull boxes and look through them kind of at your heart's content. I'm realizing that my short thing is getting long, so I'm just gonna head back out and show you one other thing that we've done here. In addition to the folders that show you what we've found in each archive, we also have a folder called Notes. And this is a place where we are taking notes collaboratively, and you have complete access to all of our thoughts about the things that we're finding so far. And so I guess not all of our thoughts, Anne, now that I realize you have a wall at your house covered in timeline, but anything that's on the computer you have. Anne has a lot about the early Board of Regents here. I have some stuff about the School of Agriculture people that I was interested in. Anne and I have been working together to keep track of land grab documents that we think we're finding. And so my vision for all of this is, the nice thing about it being in Google Drive is that there's a search feature. If, for example, you wanted to know everything that we had on the Morrill Act, you could just search Morrill Act and it will pull up any documents that deal with the Morrill Act. And so you can, I've seen your note, Anne. Great. So you can kind of, that's my vision for all of us, and that we also could search it together. So I'm gonna, how do I get back to the presentation? That's the folder. I'm happy to answer questions about that or show you around it more, but I don't want to take too long on it. And I do want to leave just a few minutes for questions at the end. So that being said, you know, like I said, we've had a lot of discussion within the core university team about how we might collaborate. And honestly, I had trouble writing this slide, even for reasons of language. I didn't know whether mostly to say collaboration or mostly to say support, because I think both of those are things that we're really interested in. We started going through the study prospectus that each of the tribal research fellows are creating and identifying places that the RAs on the core team might be helpful to you. And so I have just a few thoughts here, and then I'd be interested in having conversation about this. Number one, we'd be available, I think, for one-on-one archival research help. You already have a lot of support from librarians and archivists. You already have a lot of support from your faculty mentor. But we are people who already plan to be in the archive quite a bit and have more time, honestly, if you just even want someone to think with. And that was how I first got into the archive piece of this, is that at that point in time, Anne was going alone, and Ben hadn't started going in yet. Adriana hadn't started going in yet. And Anne was just like, I need someone there with me to think with. And so, like, you know, we can be of help in that way. We can be of help photographing documents. If you're not coming to the Twin Cities and you really want someone to go through a certain box for you, we can do that. We've had some conversations about what that would mean, like how much curation is involved in photographing documents. Do you want us to photograph every single thing we see, or do you want us to do some thinking on your behalf about like what would actually be useful? And so we could have conversations about that. And then the last place that we thought perhaps there's some room for support from us is another piece of the study prospectus that you're working on, is identifying guides and resources that will help you in your work. And again, I'm seeing your note, and yes, don't go alone. If you are not finding guides and you are not finding resources, like if next week you're starting to look and there's just no research guide available on the topic that you are wanting to study, you've got a whole team of people here who don't necessarily have expertise in that topic either, but are like a team of people to help you. And so if you just want someone to go in and like see everything we can find quick and dirty in a week, like we could talk about things like that too. So I may have skipped some things that we talked about, so others from the core team can jump in as well. But I just want to emphasize how much we'd like to support your efforts. We realize the immensity of this project and how much we would like to follow your lead and work together in whatever way is useful. So I will stop there. And it looks like we have 15 minutes left before the session is over, and we can do some Q&A or some discussion about next steps for working together as university and tribal researchers. Thanks.
Hi, something that I was thinking about when you were going through that. So as a TRF, as I identify my own primary and secondary sources, how do I upload that into the Google Drive? I know I don't know if we've had that conversation as an internal team, or if we're going to create like a folder for Red Lake, a folder for Leech Lake, you know what I mean? And then we add our own sources that we found in there. So that's just something I was thinking about as we were going through, or as you guys were presenting.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think with so much of this, we all need to be, there's no one answer, and we need to be thinking together. And I know, like, Mike, you are an archivist. And so if others have thoughts about this, go ahead and jump in. I mean, one thought I have is if you're finding, I like having like it organized by archive, I think will help us with citations later and will help us find each other's stuff. So that's one thought I have, is that if you're just taking notes on stuff you're reading about in the archive, using the process that we've used where you kind of put it in that archives folder and would be good. On the other hand, I know we've been talking about, especially in the notes section, it being good to know who wrote what notes. And so like Ben was suggesting, even within the university team, we color code our notes so that we know who wrote what. And so, yeah, something to think about there in terms of, yeah, open to thoughts. Does anyone have other questions, either questions for Anne or Ben, or comments for Anne and Ben about the research they've done, or questions or comments about possibilities for supporting one another in this research at this point?
I have a comment about when Anne was presenting on the Board of Regents. I know that when like the treaty negotiations were going on, like the role of the translators in all of that as they were, you know, working together. And I know that there is some translators that weren't so good, you know what I mean? And just like the role of those people in the interactions with the university and how much impact they had as well.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Adriana. I really haven't come across anything that they've written about at all about translators. There's really no mention of Native people at all in the archives. There is an absence, a noticeable absence.
I have a couple of real quick questions if in the moment of silence there. So the first one is for Anne, and I just want to know, did the university receive that requested double allocation as a territorial institution and a state institution?
Yeah, so the 1851 allocation went to fund the creation of the agricultural school, as it was known then, and then the 1862 is what we know as the Morrill Act. So yeah, they were, and then there continued to be subsequent land grabs that were smaller, but I think Kyle had mentioned those in his presentation on the story map, and he's working on building those into it. But he's not working on this project full time anymore this semester, so it's kind of just you know, when he has spare time.
Okay, cool, thanks. So part of the reason I ask is, Ted and I have talked about how the territorial nature of the university perhaps brings about some unique implications for trust responsibility or trust relationship with the federal government that would endure today. And that may be a kind of clever rhetorical idea, but I also think it's material and substantive as well. My other quick question is for Ben, and maybe for Kevin Whalen too, because I think Kevin gestured toward this earlier this week. But wasn't it Jenks that was centrally involved in that pseudoscience regarding blood quantum and dispossession of allotments at White Earth, the competency stuff?
Yeah, I didn't go into specifics, but that was what I was alluding to when I said that he was utilized by like state federal actors for federal policy or Indian policy. There was a specific land dispute that he had been tasked with, and blood quantum was a factor in how he worked towards, reaching whatever settlement or agreement was on that land dispute.
Joseph, the name that comes to mind for me is Herdlitzka. And that's just, I'm thinking back to, it's been a long time, but Melissa Meyer's book on White Earth. And so Herdlitzka, I guess, is the one I was thinking of.
And for anyone who's interested, I just sent a link. And with the University of Minnesota Library, you can look up this article that highlights what Joseph was talking about with White Earth and Albert Jenks.
I guess I just wanted to circle back to Anne's comment about the emotional support. I know that for me today, I'm like really feeling the secondary trauma of everything that we've been discussing this week, and just like the heaviness, right? And the need and to remember taking care of ourselves, and as we engage in this work, and the emotional trauma that comes with it. So
Yeah, and I do want to say, because this was something that Anne and I talked about when I first started joining her in the archive, is like, I think this is also a place where, those of us who are non-native bear some responsibility to help share the load in this research to the extent that it is welcome. And so, yeah, I think, it's a hard line to walk, because on one hand, it's really important that we let, especially the tribal research fellows, let you take the lead and not try to direct your research and not try to take over your research. On the other hand, this is a way that some of us, that I can be a resource and that others can be a resource to just pitch in. And we would like to do that.
So, yeah, thank you, Adriana, for expressing and verbalizing and acknowledging that, and Miigwech Ann for advising us to take in that emotional support. And one of the things that I would like to share, when I talked with my sister and my brother and told them, explained to them what this research is and what it could be for Leech Lake, man, they really advised me to take care of myself. And my sister actually said, you really need to set a dish out before you start this delve in, and acknowledge that, acknowledge those beings and our ancestors that sacrificed a lot for us. And I really I really appreciated her telling me that, because I knew that. And that was absolutely one of the teachings that I held. And so I just wanted to share that with the other research fellows. You all referenced serendipity and how it seemed that things were just falling into place for you, and you were kind of stumbling across those articles and those papers that you needed to. And it wasn't luck. You know, this really is work that is being guided, that goes beyond this physical realm. And I have found that in my work lately, that when we pay attention to our spiritual health, everything kind of falls into place. And so I really appreciated today's session, hearing from Anne and Ben and Sophie and Adriana, like all week long, just hearing all of your contributions, and understanding and wanting to tell you that y'all aren't alone in this. This is, you know, you may feel like it oftentimes, but there are folks in your communities that do know and do understand. And even in the broader American Indian community, there are folks that have felt absolutely alone when they have started doing the research. And I think that if we can continue to have like check-ins, mental health check-ins are huge, you know, that emotional support is absolutely needed in this time. So I just wanted to share that with you. Yeah.
Thanks, Lori. I just want to say we have been thinking about how we can provide services for this, and maybe Misty can send out some more information. Minnesota Transform has agreed to offer, I don't know, Misty, maybe you can talk about what that is, what that looks like or could look like.
Yeah, I think we're still in development, but and we'll talk about it, later if others are at the next session that aren't here yet. But definitely welcoming suggestions at this point. But I see us having emotional support as a collective during our drop-in sessions, and likely those will be facilitated by two people. I have two people in mind, but I still want to do some coordination with them. And then we can also make a request that individuals who want one-to-one type of emotional support, that support be made available as well. So if people have trusted individuals that they would recommend, just go ahead and either message me or email me, because I have two people in mind, but they may or may not be someone that everyone can connect with. So, but yeah, I do think that holding that collective space together during the drop-in sessions is important. And then there's the other option of having individual one-to-one conversations too. What are people's, I guess, thoughts about that? Or maybe we should pause. Does the core research team have any other things to share with this group while the session is ongoing? And maybe we can talk about we can continue talking about the emotional support at the last closing session.
I think that sounds good to pause and pick up again at the next session. I just want to thank you all. Well, I want to thank Anne and Ben for sharing your research today and just for all the work that you've done on this over the last year and a half, and for thinking so thoughtfully about your experience in the archive, especially like listening to you talk through that process was just really eye-opening to me. And then to the rest of you, I really want to thank you for coming and emphasize once again how eager we are to work with you and in whatever way that ends up being, and how open we are to your suggestions about what that will look like moving forward. So thank you.
Chimiigwech, thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks a ton, everybody. So we will take a break then for an hour and a half, it appears, and we'll be back at noon with the plenary session for everybody, the sort of closing component of this week. Same Zoom link at noon. See y'all again soon.
Take care, everyone.